r/Nosleep, posted by Reddit user RichardSaxon. If the sky goes dark in the middle of the day, hide. Part 1. One last thing. If it ever goes dark in the middle of the day, just stay in your house and hide, the driver said before falling silent. I chuckled at the bizarre suggestion. As if it hadn't been enough to instate a ridiculous nighttime curfew and forbid any romantic attachments with the inhabitants of the town, they also wanted me to hide from the dark? This ain't no joke, detective. If you can't follow these instructions, we're turning around, and I'm taking you back to the city. He slowed the car and looked back at me. He hadn't been the friendliest person. Hell, he hadn't even given me his name. But the pure intensity of his stare made it clear how serious he actually was. Alright, as you wish. Why would it go dark in the middle of the day anyways? Last time I checked, there wasn't a solar eclipse scheduled this year. Before the driver could answer my half-serious jab at his rules, a van came speeding towards us. He pulled us to the side of the narrow road, allowing the van, with its flashing blue lights, to pass unobstructed. In the split second where it drove by, I noticed 2 police officers occupying the vehicle. Well, they seem to be in a hurry, I said, expecting the driver to explain. Seriously, why are they driving out of town in such a rush? I continued. Well, they're looking for Patrick. Deadass tried to leave town a few days ago. I guess a local hunter must have found him. The second comment piqued my curiosity. The ominous insinuation, said in such casual manner, meant I had to keep digging. What, you're trying to tell me he's not allowed to leave? No, of course he is. Don't be stupid, it's just that... He trailed off. Just that what? I asked. He sighed. Listen, I'm just a damn driver. If you have any questions, the sheriff will be happy to fill you in. He seemed on edge just having me in his car. I had offered to drive into town myself, but the powers that be had insisted I get picked up, as the road was treacherous and confusing. Based on what I'd seen so far, they hadn't lied. The road was broken and in dire need of maintenance, and there were almost no signs to guide our way on our journey. Before long, we passed the first road sign I'd seen in hours. Just a simple piece of wood with the town's name written on it, Tenebrous. Not a particularly welcoming sight, but it served its purpose. After another mile or so, we pulled into an almost empty street. No more than 5 minuscule buildings that were supposed to be houses. The driver parked outside one of them and got outside. After you drop off your stuff, I'm taking you down to the sheriff's department, he said. Before we entered my humble abode, the driver walked over to the power box and flipped the switch. Dim lights flickered to life, barely illuminating the dark interior. The place was run down and barely comparable to a 2-star motel. Not that it mattered while I was on the job. Luxuries had never been part of my work. As we entered, bugs and insects scurried away from the wet doormat covering the floor. The place only seemed to have 3 rooms. The main one was a living room with a sofa bed and a stove, a hybrid room for all purposes. Other than that area, there were 2 doors, one leading to the bathroom, and one with a sign reading curfew pantry. I tried to open it, but the door wouldn't budge. How come it's locked? I asked. Without speaking a word, the driver walked over and gave it a solid pull. After the 3rd or so attempt, it flew open, revealing hundreds of canned, non-perishable goods. It was enough to feed a family of 4 for about a year. I'm only staying a month, you know that, right? I asked nervously. He sighed and nodded. It's just for emergencies. If it suddenly goes dark, there's no telling how long we'll be stuck for. So, in case the sun vanishes, I just stay here? For how long? I asked half sarcastically, still skeptical to the whole situation. He thought for a moment before responding. Usually. Just a couple of hours, he trailed off. Usually? God knows it could be longer. How long? I asked firmly. He fell silent again, not willing to answer the stream of questions I kept producing. Look, just drop your damn bags and let's go visit the sheriff, he ordered. Without further argument, I put my bags down on the table, careful to keep them away from the bug-infested floors. I chuckled briefly to myself, thinking that in the very least I wouldn't be lonely. As we drove through town, I got a better look at the tired-looking buildings. They all seemed so ancient, as if they'd been built back in the 50s, and subsequently forgotten about. There were a few people out on the streets, all looking cold and exhausted beyond measure. None of them particularly excited to have a stranger visit them, it seemed. The sheriff's department didn't fare much better than the rest of the town. It was a mix of an office building and a jail, too small to keep many criminals in place. But I suppose in a town that small, crime wasn't much of an issue. At least, officially, the deaths had all been ruled an accident. An older man came to greet us as we arrived, accompanied by 2 young officers. He wore a thin smile on his face, a tired one at that, but the first sign of friendliness I'd met. I reached out my hand and he gripped it firmly. "Well, you must be Robert," he said as he shook my hand. "Name's Bill Riley. I'm the sheriff around these parts." The other 2 didn't smile. They just stared at me with suspicion in their eyes. "Why is he here anyways?" one of them asked. The sheriff turns back towards him with a smile vanishing, replaced by a stern look, and the man fell silent. And the sheriff redirected his attention towards me. "Don't mind them. It's good to have you here. We're in dire need of a forensic pathologist, and especially after," he said before I interrupted him. "Hold on a moment. I'm not a pathologist. Not anymore, at least." "But your file said that was a long time ago," I said quickly. The sheriff took the hint and didn't push the issue any further. Before we can get inside, a van pulled up behind the building. It was the same one I'd seen speeding past us as we entered town. The sheriff rushed over to assess the situation, and they pulled a covered stretcher out from the back. "You found him?" the sheriff asked, surprised. The officers nodded and carried the stretcher inside. We followed them through a set of metal doors which led to an old-fashioned autopsy lab. The distinct smell of formaldehyde burned through my nose as we got inside. The sheriff pulled the covers off the stretcher, which revealed the pale corpse of a middle-aged man. While the cause of death wasn't immediately apparent, I suspected some sort of cardiovascular condition, with his eyes deep red from subconjunctival bleeding, and his legs swollen. "Where'd you find him?" the sheriff asked. "Just at the edge of town. He didn't even make it across the border. Poor bastard." They all stared helplessly at the dead man on the table, before directing their attention at me. "Robert, would you mind assisting us with the autopsy?" I took a step back and the sheriff noticed my trepidation. With a look of mild concern, he put his hand on my shoulder. "Look, I wouldn't ask you if I had another choice. I'll stay behind and help, but I just can't do it on my own." After an eternity of uncomfortable silence, I put the discomfort aside and agreed to help. I realized that while most of the officers in the room had dealt with dead bodies, none have ever dealt with dissecting a cadaver. Just the act of cutting human being up into their most basic parts was something entirely different that I'd never gotten used to. Together, we jotted down all the basic information regarding the man, who I had come to know as Patrick Lawrence. After taking down his height, weight, age, and observed all minor wounds, bruises, and the other recognizable marks on his body, time had come to get the scalpel. "You don't have to be here for this," I said as I looked at the profusely sweating sheriff. "I'm fine." "So, you have an autopsy lab but no pathologist on site?" I asked, more to get his mind off the sight in front of him than out of curiosity. "Yeah, we do," he trailed off. "Well then where is he?" You're looking at him," as he gestured towards the corpse in front of me. I felt ashamed. Being from a larger city meant that all my cases had dealt with strangers. But in a town such as small as Tenebrous, everyone is either a colleague or a friend or family. "Sorry," I mumbled. Without further ado, I sank my scalpel into the man's abdomen. The blade cut through the skin and fat without a problem. I created the typical Y-shaped incision necessary for easy access. Then I put my hand down the nearly formed hole to expand open his cavities. Inside, I expected resistance. I fumbled around for a bit with the wet and slightly warm sensation of decaying organs brushing against my hand. Panic started to rise in my body as I realized that instead of half-rotten organs, I felt nothing. No, this can't be right, I mumbled to myself. What? Our abdomen and chest cavity were visible. There within Patrick Lawrence, instead of a heart, lungs, kidney, and liver, there was nothing. Just a few chunks of what resembled minced meat, as if someone had shredded him to pieces from inside. The two of us stared at the empty corpse on the table. The sheriff, as disgusted as he might have been, he didn't seem at all surprised. "Did you know?" I asked him quietly, but with a demanding tone. "Know what?" "What state the corpse would be in?" I continued, more agitated than before. He sighed. No, I didn't. According to the vague reports about the town I'd been given, at least a dozen people showed up dead each year. While the number on its own was ludicrous for such a small town, it would be impossible not to have noticed their complete lack of internal organs. "Do you really expect me to believe that, after all the people who died here in the past few decades, that none showed up like this?" "They never did show up," he said as we left the autopsy lab. We walked into his office where he pulled out a bunch of photos, all showing what appeared to be extremely decayed and partially skeletal remains. We've always found them months after the fact, and by then it wouldn't be much of a surprise if a wildlife had stripped their insides. But this is something else. He put the photos away and locked his office. "So, you've never found any fresh, hollowed out corpses?" I asked. "No, not really. Well, actually, Patrick, his last autopsy seemed to have disturbed him." "What happened?" "Well, 3 days ago, our local pharmacist went missing at night. When we found him the next day, he'd long since died, and Patrick did the autopsy. And? Well, he kept raving about the emptiness inside, making no sense. It was like he was completely lost, which isn't all that weird considering the job, but we didn't know exactly what he saw. He burned the body before we could stop him, and then he fled town." We exited the building to report the other officers, all of them smoking and relaxing, as if nothing had happened. He briefed the others when I lit up a cigarette of my own, a nasty habit I'd quit years ago, but considering the circumstances, it felt appropriate. The sheriff kept glancing at his watch and then, rapidly checking the sun. Time had gotten away from us, within the windowless autopsy hall, and curfew was about to start. "Well, you better head home, Robert. We'll catch up in the morning." I tossed the half-finished cigarette on the ground. "Wait. First you're going to tell me what the hell is going on here." "Tomorrow. I promise," he said as he reached out his hand. "I appreciate your help today. I really do." Hesitantly, I agreed to leave. The driver took me back to my house without speaking a word, and I headed inside to get ready for a restless night. It was an uncomfortable place to live, with boring food and a bathroom that had no functioning light, meaning I had to use the provided flashlight just to take a piss. I searched the pantry for something to eat, and to my surprise, I found an unopened bottle of whiskey just resting there. I drank it while going over the case files I'd been given prior to my departure towards Tenebrous. 5 detectives had been sent there before me. All have returned unsettled, but none the wiser regarding the strange deaths. By the time I'd finished half the bottle, I drifted off to an uneasy slumber, a sleep filled with complicated nightmares of my past, events and impossible situations I struggled to escape, but that had ultimately landed me here in Tenebrous. I awoke early in the morning of the next day, with a splitting headache and an overabundance of regret. I glanced at the time to see it had only gone past 7 a.m., meaning I still had ample time to recover. The first daylight peeked through my window, and I grumpily covered them with the curtains, hoping to get another hour of sleep before I got up. I could have sworn only a second passed before I awoke to the sight of bizarrely warm air around me. I got up intending to open the window when I noticed it was completely dark outside. Surprised, I started to panic, worried that I'd slept through the entire day. Hungover and annoyed, I grabbed my phone to call the sheriff when I noticed the time. 7:42 a.m. Only 40 minutes had passed. I stuck my head out through the window and tried to get a look around. Even the streetlight seemed obscured by the darkness, their yellow glow barely visible. I dialed the number to the sheriff's department, but they didn't pick up. Then I attempted to call Sheriff Riley's personal number, but he picked up almost immediately. His voice was obscured behind a static-like mesh sound. Bro, it happened. Inside. Outside. He managed to get out before the connection broke, the driver's warning playing a loop in the back of my mind. If it ever goes dark in the middle of the day, just stay in your house and hide. Then I saw someone move out on the street, just a shadow hidden in the dark. With the warning of danger lurking in the dark, I was torn between hiding or calling out to check if the person needed help. He wasn't far away. I can get him in safely, easily enough. Hello, are you all right? I called out, my voice muffled as the air itself had grown too thick. The shadow heard my call and turned towards me. It moved with unnaturally exaggerated movements, seeming to skip steps. At first I thought it was one of my neighbors, but even as it walked under the partially dim streetlight, it still didn't come into proper view. It dawned on me that the thing wasn't human. I wanted to duck away from my window and hide, but I was frozen in fear. My eyes kept focused on the slowly approaching figure. Then I noticed another shadow approaching from down the street, and another, and another. Dozens of shadows wandering the streets of Tenebrous, all of them heading towards me.